Roger Marshall picked up the phone. "Hello?" "Roger, it's me." It was his older sister, Teresa. Her voice sounded strained. "Hi, Teresa. What's wrong?" "Daddy got worse. I should have called you." Roger tensed. His father had just turned 68 when he suffered a heart attack 3 months ago. He'd undergone successful triple bypass surgery, spent a week in the hospital, and then was discharged when his condition stabilized. "What happened?" asked Roger. "He was fine the last time I saw him." "I know, but he got depressed. The doctor said he had a stroke." "A stroke? Shit!" Roger felt tears come to his eyes. "But last week the doctor was sure he was fine. I thought he'd recovered and was feeling well at home." "He is at home. I mean, at Uncle Anthony's. The stroke was minor, but with his failing health, even a stroke like that is serious." "Yes. Thank goodness it's not worse," Roger replied. He knew that his family had moved in with their friends, the Blaylocks, after the operation. His father had always been a strong pillar in the family. He was the rock that his emotionally fragile mother held on to. Roger remembered from childhood that his mom never knew how to handle stress. So, when his father suffered a heart attack, it was no surprise that she turned to her old friend Monica Blaylock and her husband Anthony. Although they were not blood relatives, they had always been close family friends. Roger, Teresa, and their younger sister Samantha considered the Blaylocks almost family. They had all grown up calling them Uncle Anthony and Aunt Monica. "Yeah, that's too bad, Roger. I've never seen him like this. Can you come back? Dad really needs us right now, and Mom needs us too." "Sure," he agreed. "Okay, I'll settle things with Rebecca. I'm not sure if she can take more days off work. I'll probably just come alone." "Okay, try to get here as soon as you can. Dad's not feeling well. No. How's Mom doing?" There was a pause before Teresa replied uncertainly, "She's fine." Roger found this odd. He expected his sister to explain further. Instead, a long pause followed, after which Teresa said in a serious tone, "I have something to discuss with you. It's very important." "Really? What exactly?" "I don't want to talk about it over the phone. We'll discuss it when you get here. Just let me know you're coming. I need to talk to you alone before I meet with Dad." "That sounds cryptic. Can't you give me at least a hint?" "Just come over soon. I'll explain everything when you get here." "Okay. I'll see you in a few days then." "Thanks, Roger. I look forward to seeing you again." "Me too, Teresa. See you soon." Roger hung up the phone, feeling the strangeness of ending their conversation. He couldn't imagine what kind of information was so important that it couldn't be discussed over the phone. He would have to find out on the spot. Well, Roger knew that his father's health had left a lot to be desired lately. His father had never been a sports enthusiast or frequented a gym. However, he had always worked hard as an auto mechanic. After high school, he was drafted into the Army, where he trained and repaired military equipment while serving in Vietnam. Elvis Marshall, Roger's father, was not in combat but was proud of his service. He rarely talked about it outside of the family and rarely mentioned it within the family. When asked, he would say that his service was his duty and he was proud of it. One day, Roger jokingly asked if his father had any desire to dodge the draft. Elvis threw him a stern look and said firmly, "Never, not in this life." Roger never brought the subject up again. Roger knew a little about his father's time in Vietnam. Elvis had been stationed away from the main fighting, but had gotten into a firefight one day. He was seriously wounded. Shrapnel hit him in the neck and legs. The neck injury healed, but his leg remained a problem, and Elvis has limped ever since. After completing his 4-year tour of duty, Elvis ended up in a hospital bed in Saigon before returning to the States. A few years later, he met his wife Irene, and Teresa was born to them. 2 years later, Samantha was born. They decided that 2 girls were enough. Irene started taking birth control pills, and for the next 10 years the family consisted of 4. However, when Irene was in her 30s, she suddenly became pregnant again. Thus was born their unexpected child, Roger, whom they loved as much as their older daughters, even though he was a surprise. Upon returning home from work, Roger informed his wife Rebecca that his father's health had taken a turn for the worse. As expected, she had already used up all her vacation days during their last visit to see his father and couldn't afford to take any more time off. So Roger took a few vacation days the following week, left home Friday night after work, loaded his things into the car, and said goodbye to his wife. It was a 4-hour drive to his hometown, and he tried to get there as quickly as possible. A few miles before his destination, he texted his sister. A message came back, "Meet me at Cassin's Diner. Do you know where that is?" Roger replied, "Yes, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Teresa was already sitting in the booth and waving to him as he entered. Her light brown hair and fair facial features reminded him of his mother, who was a natural blonde. Samantha looked like her too. She had blonde hair and fair skin. Roger had always thought he looked more like his father, even though he was taller and had darker hair. He was more muscular than his father, with darker, almost black hair, and could grow a beard in a couple weeks. Even if he shaved in the morning, he had noticeable stubble by evening. Teresa jumped up from her seat, and they hugged and kissed warmly. "Glad you made it, Roger." "Of course. I want to help." Roger noticed the worry on her face. Something was troubling her deeply. They ordered coffee and a brownie each. When the waitress left, Teresa cast a sober look at her younger brother and lowered her eyes. I don't know how to tell you this." She stared at the table and bit her lip. "Just say it, Teresa. I can see it's bothering you." "Okay." She took a deep breath and exhaled. "Roger, there's something you don't know about our family. It has to do with Uncle Anthony." "Okay." "You do remember that Mom and the Blaylocks have been friends since college?" "I knew it. Mom and Aunt Monica shared a room. They went to the same college, and that's where they met Uncle Anthony." "I know that, too. A couple years after college, Mom met Dad at some party, and here we are." "So?" "They've all been friends ever since. Mom and Dad got married, and a few years later, Anthony and Monica got married, too." "Yeah, Mom was Monica's maid of honor." "Right. I don't know if you know that. Before you were born, Dad had to leave town for a few months to go to mechanic school. He was new to the company, and the classes were pretty far from home. The company only allowed him to come home once during the entire training, and that was only for a couple days. He used his veteran's benefit to pay for the training. During the time he was away, Mom seemed to get depressed and go a little crazy." "What does that mean?" Teresa shook her head and mumbled, "She did something stupid, Roger. She had an affair with Anthony." "What?" Roger shouted too loudly, and the other diner patrons began to look around. He lowered his voice and continued, "Mom? Was she having an affair? With Uncle Anthony? What the hell?" "Yes, Mom did something stupid. I know that now." Roger leaned back in his chair, trying to comprehend the unexpected news. His mother had cheated on his father with Anthony Blaylock? Unbelievable. "When did you find out?" he asked. Teresa looked away, looking guilty. "I knew about it almost from the beginning." "How is that possible?" "I knew she was seeing him when Dad was in school. She'd hire a babysitter for us, and Anthony would pick her up from the house. She'd say they were going out to dinner or to a show. Dad and Anthony were friends, and he was at our house a lot. I just thought he was trying to cheer her up because Mom was sad about Dad's absence." "Didn't you think it was weird that he was picking her up and taking her to dinner? Where was Monica during that time?" "I didn't think it was unusual at the time," Teresa said, genuinely trying to make him understand. "Monica had been with him several times, so she was certainly aware of what was going on. They'd come home to pick up Mom, and as they left, they'd laugh and chat happily. It seemed innocent enough. There were times when he would come home alone and do some small chores around the house. I thought he was just helping Mommy while Daddy was away. That's how I perceived it at the time, and my mom let me think that way. It wasn't until I was in high school that I realized she was cheating on Daddy." "Did it go on that long?" "I'm sorry, Roger. I should have told you about it sooner, but I guess I was pretty naive then. I understand better now." "Don't worry, Teresa. You were a child and couldn't have known everything." There was a pause before Roger asked, "I take it Samantha knows too?" She threw him a sad look. "I can't have any secrets from her. You know that, sisters." "Yes, I understand." Roger felt his head spinning with this news. He hadn't expected anything like this. He watched his older sister fidget in her seat, her eyes darting around. This was not a good sign. "This isn't over yet, is it?" "Yes, unfortunately," she replied sadly. "It's really hard. I hate to tell you this, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We've had too many secrets as it is." She looked him straight in the face and stated emphatically, "Roger, I'm not sure Dad is your biological father." "What? Me? No shit. Really?" "Yeah, I'm sorry. I think you might be Uncle Anthony's biological son." "You did this last..." Teresa's voice shook as she made her statement. Then she burst into tears and pressed her hands to her face, sobbing and looking at her dark-haired brother, who was shocked. "You're kidding. You've got to be kidding. Oh my God." Tears came to his eyes and he quickly brushed them away so she wouldn't see. "No, but I wish I was," she replied, snorting. "But I'm not sure. I hope I'm wrong. I was talking to my mom about it the other day. She said she doesn't know for sure either, but she thinks she got pregnant by Anthony then." "You showed up a little over 9 months after they'd already started an affair, and your resemblance to Anthony is too great to deny. Dad never mentioned it, so I don't think he realized the possibility." It took Teresa a moment to calm down and continue. "Oh?" "Until Mom let the secret out a few weeks ago. What a stupid bitch she is. He was still recovering from his heart attack when she told him about her affair. Dad's been depressed ever since. That's probably why he had the stroke. He took the news so hard." "Shit," Roger snapped angrily. "Dad's crushed. Damn her to hell. Why the hell did she decide to reveal it just now when he's in such a fragile state?" "It was probably a medication mix-up," Teresa explained. "That's what we all think. Mom's been on antidepressants for a long time. You know how she is. But she recently got a new doctor. I think she met him at the hospital when Dad was having surgery." "A new doctor? For what?" "Oh, I don't know. Mom was always a hypochondriac. She hung around the hospital and no doubt met a bunch of doctors there. Apparently she talked one of them into taking her on as a patient. I guess she didn't tell him about all the medications she was already taking, and he gave her a new prescription for nerves. Unfortunately, it conflicted with what she was already taking. It made her delirious, and she blabbed the whole story to her father during their argument." Roger leaned back in his chair, stunned, his brain working at maximum capacity, trying to assimilate this disturbing information. "So, he might not be my real father?" Roger sighed thoughtfully. "No, he's your real daddy," exclaimed Teresa. "My God, Roger, don't ever think otherwise, please." I know he is. Of course he is," he replied, embarrassed. "You're absolutely right, Teresa. He's my daddy, and I love him. It doesn't matter if he's my biological father or not. I know he loves me and always has. He will always be my real daddy." "Thank you," Teresa wheezed and reached across the table to take his hands. For a few moments, brother and sister held hands, sharing their grief. Teresa hated to tell her brother the truth, but he had to know. After a few minutes, Roger shook his head and said, "What a mess. Tony's a scoundrel for taking advantage of the situation, and Mom's an idiot. Poor Dad. I can only imagine how he feels about her betrayal. His family is everything to him. I can't believe Mom could be such an unbelievable fool. A secret she's kept for decades suddenly comes out as Dad is fighting for his life. What are the odds of that? He didn't take it very well. And how are things now? Are the Blaylocks still in possession of her?" "Yes, for the moment, at any rate. I can imagine he doesn't like living under the same roof as his wife's former lover. But he's pretty helpless, and Mom doesn't want to come home to take care of him. She said she's upset and needs Tony's help," Teresa added in a bitter tone. And of course old Uncle Tony will be only too happy to help." She swallowed to suppress the bitterness and continued, "But, as you'd expect, Dad hates him now. He's made that clear to Tony, and he won't let Mom help him with anything, and neither will Monica." And how is he coping?" Roger asked. "Not doing well at all. Of course he needs help. There was no one to help without Mom, so they took him to the Blaylocks. Tony gave him a private room in his house and hired a nurse to take care of him. He has a physical therapist, too. Surely Tony can afford it." "Yeah, The bastard's loaded. We all know that. It's so sad, Roger. I visit him regularly, but he won't talk to me or Samantha. I think he found out what we knew, but didn't tell him. Now he feels like the whole family has betrayed him. He's so depressed I almost cry when I see him. I can imagine. Poor guy. What a cruel reckoning for all his labors. He's been a faithful husband and a great father all his life. Honest, hard-working, a great provider, and look how that turned out. Shit. The brother and sister sat at the table, deep in thought. After a while, Teresa looked at her brother. I know this is a shock to you. I hated to tell you, she confessed, but I love you, Roger. We all do. Don't think this changes anything between us. Samantha knows I'm talking to you, and she says the same thing. She can't be here now, but she will be tomorrow. By the way, she says hi to you. Thank you, Teresa. You'll always be my sister, no matter what, and Samantha too. Teresa signaled the waitress for the bill and asked, Are you ready to visit Daddy? Yes, I really need to see him and help him if I can. I hope he doesn't take it too personally. You know how he is. Yes, he's always had a rigid sense of justice. To him, everything is either right or wrong, no middle ground. That's why he's so resentful. He can't accept Mom's apology, or the reasons she did what she did. He's a broken man, Roger. I don't think he said 3 words to Mom since they fought. And he just looks at Tony. I can't blame him, even after all this time, Roger said. Mom knew about their affair for decades, but for Dad it's still a fresh wound in his heart. The love he thought Mom had for him is now forever tarnished. Mom doesn't think so, Teresa said sarcastically. She acts like she just told him she wrecked the car. Mom says her affair is in the past and that she hasn't been with Tony in a long time. She doesn't understand why Dad is taking this so hard. I explained to her that even though the affair ended years ago, Dad's pain hasn't lessened. It's still a fresh wound for him, and he still hasn't recovered. He's very upset. Roger and Teresa drove separately, and as they pulled into the long driveway, Roger saw the familiar sight of the big Blaylock house. It was a 2-story mini-mansion with a manicured yard, a swimming pool, and a circular flower garden. Uncle Tony owned 3 car dealerships and several other businesses. His home was a symbol of wealth in this small community. Elvis Marshall and Anthony Blaylock were an unusual pair of friends. Tony's success in business contrasted with Marshall's modest financial situation, making their friendship unlikely over the years. Of course, now that Roger knew about Tony's affair with his mother, things made a lot more sense. Roger and Teresa were met at the door by a somber Aunt Monica. Teresa and Monica hugged and kissed. Then Roger hugged the older woman. The hug was tight and awkward. She was still a beautiful woman, slender, elegantly dressed, with perfectly styled silver hair. "Thank you for coming, Roger," Monica said sincerely. "I hope your presence will cheer up your daddy." "I hope so, too." As they were led into the living room, Uncle Tony appeared. Tall, with a stout figure, he was dressed in an expensive silk suit and patent leather shoes. Smiling confidently, he stepped forward, hugged Teresa, and shook Roger's hand. Roger noticed his slicked back black hair with gray hair that gave him a solid look. "It's good to see you again, Roger," Tony smiled. "I wish circumstances were different, but I'm very glad you're here." "Me too." "Tony," Roger restrained himself from calling him Uncle Tony. "Anyone want a drink?" "No, thanks," Teresa replied, and Roger only shook his head. "Where's Daddy?" he asked. "In the room," Tony said, pointing proudly to the large room. "We had it specially remodeled for him when he was discharged. Full hospital bed, power wheelchair, everything he needs. Everything he needs. Just ask for it." "Of course," Roger replied. Roger and Teresa left the tall man and headed for the former den. Roger was shocked at how small and helpless his father looked. The strong, confident man he had looked up to all his life had become a smaller shell of what he used to be. His head hung to the side, and he stared blankly at his visitors, sitting in a wheelchair by the window. Roger walked over and put his arm around him. Elvis lifted the hand that was still working and gave his son a weak handshake. "Hey, Dad, sorry you relapsed." Roger said, trying to make conversation. Elvis nodded weakly. His face expressed no emotion, but his eyes were fixed on his son's face. He tried to say something, but the words came out slurred. Roger leaned closer to hear the faint words. At first he started to pull away, nodding as if he understood. But Elvis held his hand resolutely, repeating his words many times before Roger understood them. During their uncertain conversation, Tony and Monica left the room to leave them alone. Roger finally realized that his father was telling him that he loved him and would always consider him his son. Tears came to his eyes. He heard a sniffle beside him and looked at Teresa. She had heard what Elvis had said and began to cry, covering her face with her hands. Roger began to choke up too. "And you, Daddy," Roger said to the old man, his voice shaking. "I love you, and I always will. I've heard about the trouble with Mom, but it doesn't matter to me in the slightest. Nothing is going to change between us. It never will, Dad." Elvis put one hand up. The other wasn't working too well. Finally, Roger realized his father wanted another hug. He leaned back, and his father's arm embraced him with surprising strength. He didn't immediately let her go. His mouth was next to Roger's ear and tried to whisper something. Roger had to listen carefully to understand what it was about. Elvis's words were inaudible, but he was saying something that he thought was very important. Perhaps Elvis was on edge too, because his words were so inarticulate that Roger couldn't understand what he wanted. Roger sensed that his father was beginning to get upset, so he pulled away, feeling uncomfortable that he couldn't understand him. They spent some more time with Elvis while Roger talked about his wife and various trivia related to work and family. When he mentioned that he wanted to see his mother, Elvis's expression turned sour. He turned away from his son and fell silent. "I'll be back in a little while, Dad," Roger said. Elvis didn't give any sign that he had heard him. Irene sat in the spacious, expensively designed kitchen, sipping coffee. There were empty plates on the table. Obviously, she had just finished breakfast. The mother was dressed in a colorful robe and slippers. Her hair was neatly coiffed, and she was wearing a little makeup. When she saw her son, her face lit up with a smile. She stood up and hugged him tightly as Roger entered the room. "Oh, Roger," she purred. "I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad you came." "Teresa called, so I had to come to see Daddy," he said. "We met a while ago. She told me something interesting about you and Tony. Very interesting story." "I'm sorry I kept you in the dark, honey," Irene said with a slight sadness. "But I didn't want to upset you or your father. You can see how hard he's taking it. I wish I hadn't said anything at all." No shit, Roger thought. Her nonchalance surprised him. He'd expected her to be more remorseful or feel ashamed of her infidelity, considering her confession was the reason her father had a stroke. "I don't know what came over me," she continued with a sigh. "I knew it would hurt Elvis to find out about my affair. That's why I never told him. It was just between me and Tony. Well, and Monica, of course. It never broke up my marriage or affected Elvis all those years ago." "How long did it go on?" asked Roger in a neutral tone. "Oh, for a while from time to time," replied the mother nonchalantly. "Tony and I started dating back in high school, before he married Monica. It wasn't anything serious. Everyone was dating back then. Monica had a couple boyfriends she dated from time to time, and Tony and I dated. We were all such good friends. Even after we broke up and Tony started dating Monica, we were still close, and the three of us would always go to parties and stuff." As she recalled her memories, her gaze traveled from her son's concerned face to a fuzzy spot on the wall, as if she were drifting back to a pleasant past. With longing in her voice, she admitted, "Even after Elvis and I married, we still saw Tony and Monica just as often. We were still close. We saw each other often. They were at our wedding, and we were at theirs. It was such a fun time. When we had Teresa and Samantha, it was one big happy family, all together. I wish it would never end." Suddenly, the expression on her face changed. "But when your father left me to take that damned course, I felt so alone. I had to handle everything on my own, taking care of your sisters and doing all the household chores. It was very hard. Tony helped me through this difficult time. Without his support, I would have lost my mind." When your father came home, I saw Tony less often. We still talked, but not as much. He was very nice to me, always willing to help. He was a wonderful man. I hope you didn't tell Dad about that, Roger replied, bristling. Irene was startled by his exclamation and whispered, Tell him what? That the guy his wife cheated on him with is so wonderful, said Roger sharply. A friend he thought was his friend, and who basically betrayed him. Not the best thing to say to a sick old man. Don't act like that, Roger, she cut off, frowning. Of course I know that. It's easy to judge me now. She waved her hand dismissively. I'm not stupid, you know that. And I didn't tell him any such thing. I just told him the truth about what was going on. He must appreciate my honesty. I'm sure Dad will be very happy to hear the truth, Roger said sharply. He may not be thrilled, she replied reproachfully, but now that he knows, he'll have to put up with it. It's all in the past, and it's too late to worry about it now. Besides, Elvis has much bigger problems than the silly affair I had years ago. I'll try to help him deal with it as best I can, but he has to help himself too. I don't doubt it, muttered Roger, annoyed at his mother's indifference to such serious matters. He turned gracefully on his heels and headed away, venting his anger at his foolish mother and her reckless behavior. Questions about his origins he put aside for later, too shaken now. This conversation would have to be postponed for another day. Teresa probably heard his angry words. She came into the room and sat next to her mother, casting him a strange look as he left the room. Roger went to the library to do some thinking. Through the sliding glass doors, he saw Monica sitting at a table on the back patio, sipping coffee. He joined her at the table. She put her arm around him and poured him a cup of coffee, and they began to talk. We didn't think it was anything bad, Monica said honestly. Irene and I were so close back then. We were like sisters, you know. We did everything together. Listening to her, Roger noticed the knowing look in her eyes. She dated Tony before me, but when I started dating him, she still joined us on dates. It seems Tony still felt something for her, so it was natural for her to stick around. She was so beautiful. Everyone loved her, and I always enjoyed her company. And Tony, too. We didn't think there was anything wrong with that. So, when Dad left for his course, Roger asked uncertainly, you just took her out to dinners? Yes. Dinners, dancing, drinking, laughing. Monica sighed, looking away, reliving the memories. God, Roger, how much fun we had in those days. Irene, Tony, and me, like the Three Musketeers. Your dad didn't like to go out. He was more of a homebody type and didn't socialize much with Irene. Maybe he just worked too much. For our family. Maybe, Monica agreed quickly. I don't think he was making much money back then, but yes, he worked a lot. When he left for his course, it was natural for Tony and I to include Irene in our plans, just like we used to do in college. We had so much fun. So, you agreed to have an affair with Tony? I guess so, Monica replied indifferently. Tony's a charming guy, larger than life, you know. We've always been friends. I knew there was a chance we'd start something. It seemed to me that if he was going to mess around with anyone, it was better with Irene than anyone else. She wasn't trying to snatch him away from me, and we were already very close. It was just a natural progression. Like I said, we didn't see it as something bad. She looked over Roger's depressed face and felt his hand tremble under her touch. She stepped closer and stroked his hand. Don't worry, darling. No one was hurt, right? If Irene hadn't given out the other day, no one would have known. And don't blame Mommy too much. She was on her own, and Tony just took advantage of her vulnerability. He can be very persuasive. You know that. She chuckled. Tony's just a charming guy. Always has been and always will be. I don't doubt it, Roger muttered. Roger felt even worse than when he'd left his mother. Neither of them seemed to place much importance on the affair with Tony. He left the older woman alone with his pleasant memories and headed back to the house. His thoughts were a mess, but suddenly it came to him exactly what his father was trying to tell him. Tools. He needs his damn tools, Roger exclaimed, glad he had finally figured it out. Elvis had always prided himself on his tools. He had a set of craftsman tools that he had bought years ago and kept in the garage. Money was tight in those days, and those tools cost him a fortune. They always symbolized his skill as a mechanic. Roger realized it was just nostalgia, and he just wanted to go back to the days when things were good. He returned to his father's room and found him looking out the window. "So these are tools, aren't they, Dad?" asked Roger proudly. "Maybe I'll get you your old tools from the garage." The expression on the old man's face suddenly changed. His eyes shone, and he began to nod vigorously. "All right, son. I know where they are. I guess you wish they were here with us. I'll get them myself, Dad. Now." Roger went to his parents' house, which was nearby. He had the key and entered the garage, remembering the days of watching his father work on the car, trying to make extra money for the family. It was typical of his father to work to provide his family with what they needed. He had always been a wonderful father. Roger felt sadness take over him and brushed away the tears. He wished his father hadn't found out about his mother's betrayal. Roger took the tools to his father. Tony was no longer home, but his mother, Teresa, and Monica were doing something in the kitchen and didn't notice him when he entered the house. He immediately headed for his father's room. Despite everything, Roger couldn't help but notice his father waiting impatiently. He waved his hand towards the corner. Roger put the tools where his father pointed and sat down next to him. They were silent. Both realized that much was unclear. Roger just looked at his father lovingly. He saw his father looking at him with his attentive eyes. When Roger got up to leave, his father invited him for another hug. Their hug was a long one. The old man did not want to let him go. His eyes were full of tears when they finally parted. "You make me cry," Roger admitted, feeling very emotional. He told his father, "I'll be back tomorrow, Dad. Don't worry, I'll help you. I'm here for you. You're going to get better quickly. You hear me?" Elvis nodded enthusiastically, watching his tall, muscular son leave the room. Roger and Teresa walked out together. Teresa wanted to leave quickly, seeing the tension between her and the two old ladies. She didn't explain to Roger what was going on, but as she passed him, she whispered, "Mom's a real bitch." "What?" Teresa only shrugged, not elaborating. Instead, she said out loud, "If you're not comfortable at the hotel, you can stay at my place. I'd be happy to see you." "Thank you, if you don't mind." They went back to Teresa's house and discussed the family's plans. A tired Roger retired to the room Teresa had prepared for him. As he was undressing, there was a distant rumble of thunder. It was an explosion so powerful that the windows shook. Roger ran out of the room and almost crashed into Teresa. "What the hell was that?" she asked worriedly. They both looked outside and saw a bright light in the distance, as if a huge bonfire was burning somewhere. "Damn it!" Roger cursed, dawning a horrible thought on himself. "I hope I'm wrong, but I think we'd better get back to Tony's." "Why?" "I need to make sure Dad's okay." She wanted to ask him more questions, but he wouldn't answer. Roger dressed instantly and ran to the car. Teresa hurried too, and they raced back to the Blaylock house at full speed. It was about half an hour after the explosion. As they turned the corner, they saw the emergency flashers of fire and police cars flashing in front of the Blaylock house. Tony's house was nearly destroyed. The bottom floor was in flames, and the upper floors had already collapsed, consumed by the flames. The firemen were trying to put out the fire, but it seemed futile because the house was already almost destroyed. "Oh my God!" cried out Teresa. "Mom and Dad, are they dead?" "I'm afraid so." Roger hugged his sobbing sister. They introduced themselves to the policeman, but the man only shrugged. "Looks like no one could have survived," he said bitterly. "When we arrived, the house was already ablaze. No one would have made it out of that inferno. It seems there was an explosion, possibly from a gas leak. We will investigate to find out the cause, but there's nothing we can do at this time. I am sorry for your loss." Roger drove Teresa home. They sat in the living room, unable to sleep. The next day they returned to the ruins of the house where detectives were already searching thoroughly for clues. Roger introduced himself and was allowed to come closer. The detectives questioned him about what had happened. Roger did not mention the tools he had brought from the house. He only reported that he believed there were 4 people in the house. "Did you find anything?" he asked anxiously. Any sign of my parents? Yes, we found 4 bodies, the detective replied. 3 of them were probably upstairs. The house is so badly destroyed it's hard to tell. Identification will have to be done later. He glanced at them and added, Oddly, the 4th body. Apparently it was downstairs in the kitchen. In the kitchen? Interjected Teresa. But Dad always lived in his room, right? Yes. This body was in the kitchen, the detective continued. We know it was near the stove or what was left of it. And what's so funny about that? Asked Roger. But don't tell that to anyone, approached the detective, whispering. But since you're related, I think the cause of the explosion was a gas leak. I'm almost certain. Really? Yes, the gas line was cut. I don't know how. It was damaged, but it still held together at the time of the explosion. I can tell you it wasn't an accident. It was done intentionally. The detective moved even closer and said quietly to the 2 siblings, It is interesting that the body near the severed gas line was holding a pipe wrench in his hand. In his hand? Interposed Teresa in surprise. It wasn't blown apart by the explosion? No, the wrench was secured in his hand, literally fixed. The detective said this with an almost mocking expression. He assumed a serious face again and continued, Apparently someone cut the wire on purpose, after which there was an explosion that destroyed the house. But why use the wire? The wire was wrapped several times around the hand holding the wrench. I've never seen anything like that before. Why would anyone attach a wrench to their hand? I'm not sure, Roger replied. Perhaps he wanted to make sure he would always have the wrench. I don't have any other explanation. All right, agreed the man. But for what purpose? Why do that? I don't know. Roger glanced at his sister's concerned face. When she tried to speak, he quickly interjected, Thank you for the information, officer. We'll keep in touch. Here's my card if you have any questions, the man said, handing him a card. My condolences about your parents. I'm not sure what happened, but it doesn't seem like an accident. Roger and Teresa exchanged glances and walked away. He now realized that his father had avenged his cheating on his wife and her possible lovers, including Monica if she was involved. Roger had reason to think so. He realized that Elvis wanted his son to know that he was the one who had made the arrangements. It had not been done by accident. Roger whispered sadly, Message received, Dad, and left, hugging his sobbing sister. He was sorry to part with his mother, and he was sad for the loss of Uncle Tony and Aunt Monica, who had been close to him as a child. But he couldn't help but respect his father, a strong and honest man who, when he became an old man, set about avenging the worst betrayal a man could endure. It was in the spirit of his resolute and firm father not to let it go unheeded. God, I'm going to miss you, Dad, sobbed Roger, giving vent to his feelings. I love you,